Good morning, everyone. My name is Courtney Musin, and I'm here along with Peyton Props, and today we are going to be talking about Fountain Hughes and his experience during slavery. Last week, Mr. Hughes had an interview to where he elaborated more on his experience during and after slavery and how poorly the African American community was treated during this time. It was very interesting to get an insider's point of view before 1949, being now that they are allowed to do things they once couldn't. Slavery has been abolished a little less than 100 years now, and there has been a shown improvement on how the African American community has been treated. Today we are going to be talking about what was said during the interview with Mr. Hughes and what he endured, as well as other African Americans endured during their time in slavery.
Just a year prior to us, the United Kingdom provided us the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, saying that we can no longer trade slaves or be provided with slaves. They informed us that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms, as people are now settling down to a different lifestyle, and as slaves are now living their lives. As now free people, we are going to be talking about how a once prior slave felt about his new lifestyle and how he is adapting. Mr. Hughes did a good job talking about the aftermath of slavery during his interview.
Life after slavery wasn't as glamorous or generous as people made it out to be. It was actually quite the opposite. During the interview, Mr. Hughes says, "We was turned out like cattle. After freedom, colored people didn't have nothing. Once slaves were free and thrown out to fend for themselves, they had no background that would help them succeed in the real world besides the real labor jobs that they were given while being slaves. They had no prior education and got paid little to nothing while still being treated like dogs. When they were in slavery, they would be lucky to even see a book." He also talks about how people were hesitant when it came to African Americans paying for things because they had thought they had stole the money, and that men above the age of 21 weren't allowed to buy things at stores. I had no idea that this was happening, and I'm baffled. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and acquired freedom to African American community. I didn't know how much not being a slave would have affected them because they didn't have any prior skills. Khan Academy issued out a statement saying, although slavery was over, the brutalities of white race prejudice persisted. After slavery, state governments across the South instituted laws known as Black Codes. These Black Codes were legal rights given to African Americans, such as serving in juries, the right to marry, and the right to own property, and so much more, good and the bad. This was a step in the right direction because this was giving the African American community the same treatment as white people. Although it wasn't semi-fair because if African Americans didn't follow these Black Codes and they broke the rules, they would be arrested and punished for not following what they were told to do.
Right now, we are going through Brown versus Board of Education and creating more equality towards African American and better education. Of course, there's still some gray areas that need to be fixed, but with everything being segregated, as of right now, I feel as if African Americans getting as much equal opportunities as they can. Now they can ride buses and use public restrooms as well. They can use the water fountains as long as it is designed for African Americans, which is a major step in the right direction. Who knows, maybe one day we can all live in harmony and peace without having to treat people differently based on the color of their skin. Once the nation decided to abolish slavery, they had no intentions of figuring out what African Americans would do after slavery. Slaves couldn't get an education, and if they did, it was hard to find. In the document, Hughes says that it was rare to find a prior slave who had knowledge on reading and writing. Slaves were quite literally thrown out like cattle with no place to stay, but the streets like this was unfair to them, because they had no idea where to go from there or how to succeed on their own. Overall, we as American citizens need to realize that no one should ever be put out on the streets with no idea how to go up from there.
Mr. Hughes was a slave to Burness, along with his mother and father. However, his grandfather was a slave to Thomas Jefferson. When he became free, African Americans were still being treated poorly despite having been freed. He talked about how brutal they were treated and the things that he endured, as well as other African Americans had endured during their time being free. When Hughes first became freed, he wasn't technically free, nor were any other African Americans. They had no money, no one to work for, no place to stay. Like he said throughout the interview, they were thrown out just as cattle and treated like dogs. He didn't have anywhere to sleep, and when he had become free, he even stated in the interview that he had broken into a barn and slept in there along with his brother. African Americans weren't allowed to go places without a pass as well, and if they did, they would be in trouble. This goes to show how poorly people of the different race were treated even after being freed. Mr. Hughes had included these details of the torture that they went through so that people now know that that's no way to treat someone just because of the color of their skin.
The intention of this interview was to inform many people about how slaves had been treated and how inhumane it really was. Towards the end of the interview, Mr. Hughes was asked a question to what he would do if he ever had to go back into slavery, and to what he said that he would kill himself and end it all, because they were nothing but dogs in their eyes. We as American citizens need to forever acknowledge the way we treated slaves when they were in and out of freedom, and reflect on the past. No one ever deserves to be treated the way they were treated, and our country needs to be forever sorry to African Americans. Therefore, we cannot let this interview die. It needs to stay being talked about so that people know that African Americans can never and will never be treated like that again.